Black women are supposed to bow their heads and cry. Why are you standing up? The patrol officer snarled as he pointed a gun directly at a black woman in the middle of a funeral. He shouted orders, pinned her to the ground among the wreaths. He needed no reason, just the fact that her skin was not white. But what he didn't know was that the woman he aimed at was a major general in the military, respected throughout the Pentagon. And this time, the law did not side with the badge, it sided with honor. When a uniform becomes a mask for fear, who will dare to speak the name of justice? What do you think? What state do you live in? That morning, Arlington. This is a funeral, not a battlefield. National Cemetery was wrapped in a thin mist, like a white veil gently laid over a grief not yet dispersed. The national flag hung at half-staff, heavy in the early March breeze, and the air was so still that the sound of soldiers' boots stepping on dry grass felt like a blade slicing through the silence stretched taut. A row of black-covered chairs sat neatly aligned beneath the old oak canopy, where the family of the fallen soldier sat upright like flag poles unwilling to break. Children wore miniature uniforms. Adults adjusted, medals and every gaze fixed on the flag-draped casket at the center of the ceremonial zone. No one spoke. No one dared cough because this was a military funeral. A sacred event where all emotional displays were subdued to make room for the only thing permitted to remain, honor. A black SUV slid in from a side gate, the engine nearly silent. The rear door opened. Polished leather shoes touched the ground, and the figure who stepped out prompted both guards nearby to salute reflexively, almost instinctively. She wore a uniform adorned with the rank of general pinned crisply on her left shoulder, an insignia only granted to those who had walked through more battlegrounds than the conscience. Elise Monroe brought no entourage, no noise, just herself, holding a small urn wrapped in black cloth, which would be placed beside the casket as the final token of a comrade she once commanded. Her face was cold, her eyes steady, but it was the silence in her walk that made everyone nearby rise to their feet. Not out of fear, but because they knew they were witnessing something rare, a general coming to honor a soldier. Only one man did not stand. Robert Hasker, the officer in charge of security on the cemetery's west perimeter, stepped directly into the SUV's path, slapping his palm loudly onto the hood with enough force to rattle the front of the vehicle. The slap rang out harshly, jarringly out of place in the solemn service. One of the young soldiers holding the mourning flag nearby flinched, dropping the wooden pole to the ground with a dry crack. The whole area froze. A child in the front row, dressed in a miniature uniform, looked up and whispered to his mother. "Is that man yelling at her?" The mother bowed her head, but didn't respond. Her fingers clenched tightly around her mourning cloth as if holding her composure together by force. Elise stood still, unblinking, her gaze drifting slowly from Hasker's palm, still bearing the red mark from the slap, up to his eyes, cold and gray like unfinished concrete. She did not step back. Hasker didn't ask permission nor seek approval. He stepped forward, blocking her path, eyes brimming with contempt. "I thought you were with the choir," he spat, eyeing her rank as if it were a cheap souvenir bought at a tourist stand, not a general. One of the two guards exchanged a glance with the other, but neither moved. Elise slowly opened a small leather wallet, retrieved her military ID and held it up with textbook precision, saying nothing. Hasker didn't bother to take it. He merely glanced at it and said, loud enough for the entire row to hear, "They fake these things real well nowadays, especially the ones trying to prove something." A noise emerged from the seating, either clenched teeth or a stifled sob. No one could tell. Elise's expression didn't change. She lowered her arm, tucked the ID away, and took one step closer to the casket. Hasker raised his arm, blocking her, and hissed through gritted teeth. "You can't go through. This is a restricted ceremonial zone. You're not on the approved list." An older veteran seated behind a former army captain tilted his head and murmured to his neighbor, "Are we burying a soldier or burying honor itself?" The whisper didn't travel far, but it struck a buried nerve in the hearts of all who heard. No one stepped in. No one dared come between Elle and Hasker, not because they agreed, but because they didn't know. If they stood up, would the system stand with them? The sky sank a shade grayer. A gust of wind swept across, causing the flag on the casket to flutter briefly before falling still, like kneeling in silence. Elise did not budge. Her black shoes stood less than a pace from Hasker's, and in her eyes there was no rage, only something colder than contempt, a silent refusal that needed no voice. Hasker flinched slightly, but didn't yield. I have the right to ask, he said, and you have no right to respond. Without authorization from command, you're not allowed here. And don't think those stars exempt you from inspection. We're here to protect honor. His final words were aimed at the ribbons and medals on Monroe's chest. There was no sign in his tone that he believed a single one. A soft sigh escaped from the left side of the burial site, vanishing almost instantly. The flag bearer lifted his pole again. The child still looked toward Monroe, not understanding what was happening, only sensing that the woman was being pushed away from a place where she belonged. Elise turned to the casket. She didn't approach it, but she didn't retreat either. Her hand gripped the urn wrapped in black cloth like someone holding tight to a memory that could not be allowed to break. That gaze did not ask for permission, nor require validation. She stood there like a living statue in the middle of a funeral, cleaved by prejudice, by authority, and by the fear of those unwilling to see someone like her standing in a space they thought sacred only to themselves. And then, in that frozen moment, when the entire memorial was suspended by the motion of a hand that had no business holding a gun, one truth became louder than any rank or command ever issued. This was not a battlefield. This was a funeral. And at that funeral, the one meant to be honored had been replaced by a meaningless display of dominance. Elise didn't need anyone to say her name because her name and the action she was about to not take was already being recorded, not in ink, but in the shiver crawling down the spines of every. I have the right to ask. And you have no right to reply. Witness. She remained standing like a boundary that could not be pushed back. Her left hand held the urn of the fallen soldier. Her right hand withdrew the military ID that had just been dismissed. The midday sun shifted silently, casting light on the cold metal surface of the card, as if to remind onlookers that the letters engraved there came not from printed ink, but from blood, sweat, and years of service. Yet, in the face of Monroe's silence, Hasker saw defiance. He stepped forward half a pace and snatched the card from her hand with a sudden crude motion so forceful that her jacket's hem trembled under the pull. His grip clenched tight around the card as he raised it above his head, letting sunlight flood its face. He flipped it back and forth, inspecting it like someone checking a counterfeit bill at the edge of a flea market, then suddenly spat directly onto the grass at her feet, not missing by an inch. The entire area froze again. The sound of boots from the ceremonial squad in the distance halted midstep. Something had shifted. It was no longer suspicion. It had become an intention, deliberate and unapologetic. One of the young soldiers on the left flank, a white man barely past 20, hair cut sharp, medals still pristine, leaned forward, stepping half a foot as if about to speak. But the hand of his superior rested on his shoulder, squeezing gently as he whispered 4 short words. Not the time yet. The young soldier froze. Not from fear, but from comprehension. In the military, not the time wasn't a command. It was a warning that any action outside the script came with a price. And the one paying that price now was a general standing before the invisible muzzle of a weapon called doubt. The ID card remained in Hasker's hand. He didn't return it. He simply held it at eye level, tilted it side to side, then sneered. They make good fakes these days, he said, loud enough for the perimeter cameras to catch on. Mike places like Baltimore, Chicago, swarming with these. Looks real if you squint, but people who need to prove they matter always buy these things. Especially when they can't earn their rank on merit. His tone wasn't loud. He didn't shout, but the way he pressed down the final consonants like leather boots grinding into sand made every word sound like a slow ice-cold stab. Behind him, unnoticed in the bushes to the left of the ceremonial zone, where a group of journalism students had been observing with handheld cameras, a phone began live streaming. The angle was perfect, capturing Hasker's face, his grip on the card, the urn in Monroe's hand and the direct gaze she fixed on him. No one from the group stayed pressed. The weak 4G signal blurred the image, but within 4 minutes, the live feed appeared on a military forum under a blazing red caption. Cop interrogates a 4-star general lived during a funeral. Elise Monroe still said nothing. No rebuttal, no justification, no reaction. That precisely made the atmosphere feel even more haunted. She didn't need to raise her voice. She wasn't a woman who needed to shout to be heard. Instead, she stepped forward, face to face with Hasker, close enough for his breath to reach her collar. Her eyes, neither cold nor angry, carried a gaze that made the person opposite feel like they were standing in front of a mirror, forced to confront themselves, stripped of rank, badges, and excuses. Her voice dropped, not out of weakness, but with the knowledge that what she was about to say didn't need volume to carry weight. You're not doubting the card, Elise said slowly. Each word honed like a blade. You're doubting that someone like me has the right to carry it. No. Thunderclap followed, no dramatic cue, but the way her words echoed through the funeral, a space filled only with wind, and the heartbeats of those holding their breath, turned every head, even among those who had previously looked away, not because it was the first time they'd heard defiance, but because they'd never seen one this frigid, a resistance that made the accused stand still as if being strangled by their sense of honor. Hasker's lips tightened. For the first time, his face faltered slightly, not from shame, but because he didn't expect the blow to come in silence from a layer of verbal ice. No tantrum could shatter, but he didn't step back. He didn't know how. More importantly, he wasn't allowed to. To him, retreating in front of a black woman bearing a high rank meant admitting a truth he'd spent a lifetime denying. That the system no longer stood on his side. You're quite the speaker, he hissed. But according to protocol, an ID doesn't prove identity. The authority to verify belongs to me, and I haven't finished verifying. The words landed like a trap not to restrain a person, but to drag an entire sacred ritual down into the mud of personal malice. The crowd remained silent, but phones were being drawn, not to call anyone, but to record the moment. When someone representing the law used his power to humiliate someone representing unconditional service, Monroe didn't flinch. She reached out to take back her card. Hasker didn't let go at once, holding it for half a second longer like a thirsty man gripping his last drop of authority. But then she tightened her grip, pulled it back in one swift, commanding motion. It wasn't violent, but it was decisive. No one saw where her force came from, only that when the card landed in Monroe's hand, the sound of metal tapping her fingernail rang so sharply it seemed to cut the wind. She turned away, said nothing more, leaving Hasker standing in the aisle, hand empty, mouth ajar, but speechless. And as he fumbled for his next excuse, a notification appeared on the young soldier's phone at the left flank. Live stream Cop vs. General. Over 120,000 watching now. No order was given. No slogan was shouted. But from the front row, the mother, whose child wore the miniature uniform, slowly rose to her feet, not to protest, but to step into the aisle and walk toward the casket. She didn't look at Hasker. She only looked at Monroe and nodded, as if ending something that no longer needed explanation, as if beginning a new ritual in place of what should have been sacred. In that moment, no one dared say the funeral had been interrupted. Only those with discernment understood. The real burial had just begun. Not for the soldier in the coffin, but for everything this country once called untouchable. Monroe stepped forward, not one more move, and I'll take it as a threat. Rushed, not hesitant, just one step grounded in the full weight of a person who had once crossed battle lines, had once walked through life and death without asking anyone's permission. Her polished black shoes touched the compacted soil in front of the casket. Earth already cracked from heat, now exhaling under the weight of someone who did not belong to submission. Her hands still gripped the urn, steady, not a speck of ash shaken loose. Each breath she took marked a line. Each step closer was a question to everyone present. Who truly has the right to approach? Hasker blinked once, then growled. No longer sarcastic, now fully in the register of threat. You stop right now. His voice dragged like iron chains over concrete. No one saw when his fingers reached for the grip, but by the time he drew his Glock from the belt, the metallic scrape tore through the sacred silence of a military funeral like nails across glass. Cold, shrill, and so out of place. It seemed to shatter the very ceremony. Everyone heard it, but no one believed it. Monroe didn't move forward, nor did she back away. She stood her ground face to face with the muzzle now pointed at her chest. No wind passed through, yet the national flag atop the casket fluttered faintly, as if reminding them that within the stillness of this cemetery, the only thing alive was honor, and it was now staring down a barrel. One more move, and I'll take it as a threat, Hasker hissed. Arm rigid. The funeral held its breath. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Every person waited, not to see what would happen, but to see who would be held responsible for what did. Then the unthinkable happened. He shouted, not because anyone resisted, but as the final roar of someone realizing they'd lost control. I said, stop. The volume cracked the air, rupturing the gravity of the funeral. His scream was so loud the portrait at the head of the casket tilted, then tumbled from its stand, shattering on the ground. The glass cracked, the frame split open, and the photo of the young soldier who had died on some distant border rolled across the grass until it stopped at Monroe's feet. Every eye clung to that moment, like fingers gripping a cliff. In the heart of a funeral, a soldier had died. Again, not from enemy fire, but from the collapse of dignity. A lieutenant to the left of the crowd reacted on instinct and yelled, everyone back. His voice rang out like the horn of an old train, echoing, then fading. But no one moved. No one dared retreat. Not because they didn't hear, but because they knew. Stepping back now meant accepting that a cop could pull a gun in a military cemetery and no one would do a thing. A white man in uniform bearing the rank of colonel standing right next to Hasker slowly stepped aside. He didn't speak. His shoes crossed onto the edge of the paved area. Eyes looking neither at Monroe nor the gun. He looked at the casket as if to remind himself why he was here. Not to stand beside Hasker, but to see off someone who had died for their country. And Troll didn't flinch. The photo at her feet reflected the face of the fallen soldier, the one who had called her commander, who had entrusted his life to her hands. She didn't bend to pick it up, not out of disrespect, but because at that moment a bowed head would be misunderstood forever. She adjusted her hold on the urn slightly, ensuring it remained upright. The earth beneath her shoes was dry and cracked, but her stance didn't shift a millimeter. No gasps, no pleading glances, just her presence. Like a mountain standing between violence and honor. She looked straight into Hasker's eyes and spoke calm, clear, no need to raise her voice. She knew in this air so still, every word would pierce through whatever armor of self-deceit he wore. If I die here, she said, the entire country will know why. No one who heard it failed to feel their heartbeats skip. No one could explain why those words silenced everything. Perhaps because it wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a sworn testimony, a permanent record. And Hasker knew it. He knew he'd lost the upper hand. His hand didn't tremble, but his eyes broke. A few rows back, the mother, with the young boy in a miniature uniform, clenched her child's hand tightly. The boy didn't cry. He just looked at Monroe in the gun with eyes not yet shaped by prejudice, not yet trained into numbness, and whispered, "Mom, is he scared of her?" The mother didn't answer. No one did. Because that question, innocent as it was, touched on what no one dared to say aloud. That the one holding the gun was afraid of losing control. Then a breeze passed. Not strong, not cold, but enough to lift the flag atop the casket once more. In the fading sunlight, its edge flashed like a scar against morning black. In a place where guns were never meant to exist, a gun had appeared, and the only thing standing between that weapon and an irreversible act was a woman still standing tall, eyes unshaken, hands steady, and without another word. No one moved, no one pulled out a phone, no one screamed, all froze, within a frame that if cut from a video would need no caption because everything was already unmistakably clear. This was no longer about a cop and a general. This was about someone trying to preserve honor and someone trying to preserve privilege. One stood ready to endure. One stood ready to fire. And between them lay the death of a soldier and the fragile survival of a principle called justice. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the Glock in Hasker's hand seemed. Those who were present here today, redundant in a scene where each heartbeat felt like a moral stress test. The wind had stopped. The flag no longer fluttered. The cracks in the ground beneath Monroe's feet looked like fault lines running straight into the system. She now stood against, not with a weapon, not with power, but with the sheer presence of a woman in uniform. Standing upright on soil that had grown used to bowing before white authority. Monroe still didn't move. Her eyes weren't fixed on the gun, but on the photo beneath her feet, the image of the fallen soldier now lying between the muzzle and the commander who once led him. No one could hear her breathe, but everyone sensed something rising from the pit of silence, like a tremor, not yet shaking, but already fracturing the earth. And just then, the man to her left, a silver-head three-star general. His scalp close-shaven, hand gripping a cane, slightly leaned forward, not out of reverence, but because he couldn't stand fully upright anymore. He didn't collapse, but his hand trembled. His fingers clenched the cane so tightly they turned white. A tear rolled slowly down his dry cheek, not out of fear, but shame. Shame for what he knew had been allowed to happen. And shame because he, like many others there, had stayed silent for far too long to stop it. Don't, he whispered. Not to anyone in particular. As long as you keep standing, we might still save the system. His voice was old, but not weak. It wasn't pleading. It sounded like a sentence handed down upon his generation. Those who had built the walls of honor, but let cracks like Hasker's slip quietly through the mortar. Monroe didn't turn to him. She heard. But her gaze remained locked on one point, the space between the gun and the ritual, where honor was being shredded into fragments by a man who didn't understand that in the military, not everyone is allowed to aim a gun, and no one is allowed to aim it at sacrifice. Hasker held his position, but his jaw tensed. Sweat ran backward across his temple, not from tension, but from the realization that he no longer controlled the silence around him. He wasn't used to being faced without being obeyed. He wasn't used to having a threat undone by a gaze. The longer he stood there, the more restless he felt inside, the very power he held. Above, a soft buzzing sound appeared. A drone hovered midair. No one knew where from, but its lens was zoomed in directly on Hasker's face, not the frantic zoom of media crews. A slow, deliberate focus, as if etching every wrinkle, every bead of sweat, every angle of his profile into a permanent dossier. Every twitch of his now every flicker of his facial muscles was becoming evidence, and he knew it. He couldn't do anything about the lens. Couldn't point his gun at it. Couldn't shut it off. All he could do was stand there like a crime not yet named. Behind him in the honor guard formation, a young soldier quietly stepped back and bent toward his backpack. He pulled out a second flag tightly rolled inside a waterproof sleeve. It wasn't meant to replace the main flag. It was backup. And that word backup said more than any speech could. Because in a military funeral, no one prepares a second flag unless they know something might go wrong, which meant they knew. They knew. Someone might break the ritual, that someone might draw a weapon, and the soldiers had come prepared, not to mourn honor a second time. Monroe gently lifted her right heel, then set it back. Exactly where it had been. Emotion so slight most missed it, but it was a final message. She wasn't retreating nor advancing. She wasn't retaliating, but neither was she evading. In her hands was the urn of the fallen soldier. On her chest, rows of medals pinned by 3 different presidents. But in that moment, what kept her grounded wasn't what had been awarded. It was what she had chosen to hold. Principal Hasker finally spoke. He didn't yell. His voice was slow, and this time laced with something faintly resembling fear. You're provoking me on purpose. I have the right to respond if I feel threatened. No one answered. But the way the crowd looked at him, cold and unmoving, made that sentence fall to the ground like an unspent shell. Self-defeating. No rebuttal needed. Besides, Monroe, the elderly general, turned his head away. Not because he didn't want to look, but because he couldn't bear to watch a man try to convince himself that drawing a gun at a funeral counted as being threatened. At his age, he had seen many deaths, but perhaps never one as shameful as this. The death of military integrity. Choked by the phrase, "I have the right." The air in the cemetery thickened. As though each dust particle now carried weight, a dry leaf floated down near Monroe's shoe, landing without sound. A small detail, but proof that time was still passing. Only the system was stuck, caught in a space between honor and authority, between those willing to stand straight and those straining to appear righteous. A distant car horn broke the suspension. No one knew from where, but no one moved. Because everyone understood the next page of this day would not be written by the press nor decided by politicians. It would be shaped by the silent presence of those who were here. Those who saw a gun drawn in front of a casket. Those who saw a general denied the right to Approach her fallen comrade and those who would never again be able to say I. Because those who were present here today will carry what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. Not in words, but in their eyes, in how they raise their children, whether they stay silent or speak up when the next gun is drawn. Where it doesn't belong. Because those who were present here today did not merely witness the truth. They became 1 second to become history. Part of it. He was still standing there, his hand frozen around the clock, his eyes scanning, each face stiffened. Around the cemetery as if searching for someone, anyone, to justify what he had just done. But no one met his gaze, no nods of agreement, no gestures of support. And then, as if he no longer believed in the authority he held, Askar's shoulders sagged slightly, just enough for the tension between the gun and its target to dissolve into something no longer. A soft sound came from behind. The click of a weapon being unlatched by a military security officer. One man, then a second, approached, dressed in dark ballistic vests, hands correctly placed on their firearms. No one gave an order, but as they passed through the security perimeter and moved directly toward Hasker, everyone knew a chapter had closed, and it ended without gunfire, without